Welcome back to Fragmented channel. Today's fragment is films like Greek statues. I was inspired to make this video after I rewatched the old 2002 movie Minority Report. This is a Tom Cruise film directed by Steven Spielberg and loosely based on a Philip Dick novella of the same name. The film depicts a near-future world in which murder has been nearly eliminated in Washington, D.C. through the use of humans with precognitive abilities to anticipate murders before they happen and arrest and imprison those who would have been responsible. The film was a bit of a hit at the time, and I remember enjoying it when it first came out, but as I rewatched it from a perspective more than 20 years later, I found it more and more disappointing. Some elements still held up, most notably the effort that Spielberg and his team put into trying to imagine how the technology of 2002 might advance in 50 years. Two of the hallmarks of this film are the ubiquity of surveillance of human beings and the omnipresence of advertising directly tailored to individuals. In many ways, our online experience, and to a lesser degree our offline experience too, now reflect both of these qualities. But ultimately the film was dissatisfying, and the ending in particular rang quite hollow. In thinking it through, it seemed to me that the problems I had stemmed from a few notable deformities in the plot. Deformities which twisted a story which could have been quite powerful and meaningful into something which conceals real horrors from us, in the interest of generating a wish-fulfilling, happy-clappy ending. And the more I thought about it, the more it made me think of an experience I had a long time ago at a lutenist's shop. Now, this was a man whose trade was the building and repair of wooden musical instruments, such as guitars and violins. He had a worn 18th century German violin in his shop, which he was working on, and he described the instrument to me as particularly beautiful. To me, it just looked like an old, worn violin, so I asked him why he described it that way. He explained that he could see, even in its worn state, the perfect proportions and well-wrought lines that it had had when it was new. And then he said something interesting. He said, "It's like looking at a fragmentary Greek statue. You can tell from the proportions of what survives how beautiful it must have looked when it was still whole. Your mind can extrapolate an image of the original from what survives." He's right about that, but I think we can also do this with more than just old statues. I think we can also do it with other damaged wholes. And that's what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to take the movie Minority Report, identify what I regard as its major deformities, and then examine what the film would have shown us, what it would have been had those deformities not been there. In other words, we're going to extrapolate a new whole from the fragments of truth which Spielberg does show in the film, a new whole which becomes visible once the boomer tropes are removed. Before I can identify the deformities, it's necessary to briefly recall the plot. The film is set in Washington, D.C. in 2054. Tom Cruise plays a man named John Anderton, who is the head of an experimental police division called Pre-Crime. This police division employs the use of 3 young people who are kept in a state of permanent suspended animation in a watery tank and who operate together as a kind of hive mind. We discover later in the movie that all 3 of these people have precognitive abilities as the freak result of their parents being addicted to an early version of a psychoactive new drug called neuroin. Anderton himself is also addicted to this drug, which he uses to relive moments of his life with his son Sean, who was abducted 6 years previously and never seen again. Anderton blames himself for the loss of his son. His wife left him over his depression about it, and this event was instrumental in him joining the Pre-Crime division when it began. Pre-Crime was created by a man named Lamar Burgess, played by Max von Sydow. A means of recording the psychic impressions of the 3 precogs is used to identify murders before they happen. Intentional murders are easily detected, But crimes of passion, so-called red ball killings, are harder to prevent because the precogs only have visions of them a few hours before they happen. The first scene of the movie depicts one of these red ball predictions, with Anderton and his team carefully deducing from the fragmentary psychic impressions of the precogs who is involved, where it will take place, and they interrupt a man just before he breaks in on his wife cheating on him. People convicted of pre-crime are placed into an induced coma, a process called haloing, and they're held in a panopticon-like prison facility. The plot is set in motion by two intertwining elements. First, the Department of Justice has sent an agent named Danny Whitwer, played by Colin Farrell, to audit pre-crime prior to its being adopted nationwide. Second, while Anderton is visiting the prison warden, Agatha, one of the precogs, experiences a flashback of the drowning of a woman. Anderton witnesses this flashback because the prison warden has a feed of the precog's psychic impressions up on his computer. The warden explains that this is not a vision of the future or of an event that happened, but a memory of a murder which the precogs envisioned but was prevented. Such memories are called echoes. In this case, the intended victim was a woman named Anne Lively. Curious about the echo, Anderton investigates, only to learn that Anne Lively went missing shortly after her murder was prevented, and that Agatha's vision of this murder was not on file. Usually all of the precog visions of murders are kept on file as evidence. Shortly after Anderton discovers this, the precogs predict that Anderton himself will kill a man named Leo Crow, whom he has never met. Anderton flees the police department and a manhunt ensues. Anderton eludes the police and visits a woman named Iris Heineman, a genetic researcher, whose work was instrumental in Burgess's development of pre-crime. After some prodding by Anderton, she explains that, contrary to the official narrative, the three precogs do not always experience the same vision of the future. Once in a while, one of them will see a different future vision, known as a minority report. Minority reports are purged from the official record to maintain the illusion of infallibility. Agatha's vision of Anne Lively's murder was perhaps one such purged report. Anderton believes the vision of him murdering Leo Crow must also be a mistake. Hyman explains that if there is a minority report on his murder, it still exists in the memory of the precog who had it. Most likely that would be Agatha because, in an early version of the girl boss trope, Agatha is the strongest of the three and usually guides the others. Early in the film, it is established that there are retinal scanners everywhere in the city to keep track of where everyone is. To get back into the facility where the precogs are held, Anderton undergoes a black market eye transplant. It is while he is recovering from the surgery that the police unleash mechanical spiders into the squalid building where he is hiding to scan the eyes of everyone inside. He eventually gets away from this, breaks into the facility, and removes Agatha, and with her help he eludes police again. He takes her to a cybercriminal who has the technical means to access her memories, only to find that there is no minority report on Anderton's murder of Crow. But he does find Agatha's memories of Anne Lively's death, which remains mysterious. With Agatha, he then tracks down Leo Crow to a hotel room, where he finds many photos of children, including his son, Sean. Crow mutters something implying he has kidnapped and killed children, and Anderton accuses him of doing this with Sean. As this scene unfolds, Agatha pleads with Anderton to make a different choice, for some reason suggesting that he does not have to follow through with the vision. John does hesitate, smelling a setup, which prompts Crow to beg John to kill him. He reveals that he was hired to plant the photos, and his family only gets paid if he gets killed. Anderton then refuses to kill him, but Crow grabs at his gun and ends up getting shot much as the precogs had envisioned. Meanwhile, Danny Whitwer has followed up on an investigation into Anne Lively's death. which Anderton had earlier tipped him off about. He suspects that she was indeed murdered and reveals to Lamar Burgess the evidence he has collected and the reasoning he has used to determine this, at which point Burgess shoots Whitwer with Anderton's gun. Agatha being out with Anderton at this time, pre-crime is not functioning, since all three precogs are necessary, and therefore this murder is not detected. Anderton is arrested and imprisoned in the pre-crime facility for the murders of both Crow and Whitwer. After his imprisonment, his estranged wife Laura confronts Burgess at his home, where he is hosting an event to celebrate the nationwide expansion of pre-crime. She confronts him about Anderton's suspicions about Anne Lively. Burgess denies any knowledge of the situation, only to later promise to look into her drowning, an element of her death which Laura had not mentioned, leading her to suspect him of at least something. As it turns out, Anne Lively was actually the mother of Agatha. She had overcome her heroin addiction and returned to Burgess to demand custody of her daughter back. As this would have meant the end of pre-crime, Burgess devised a plot to kill her without being detected by his own program. He hired someone to murder her, knowing this person would be detected and caught, only to show up himself in disguise shortly after the man's arrest and murder Anne in the same way the precogs had detected. He knew that his actual murder of Lively would be dismissed by pre-crime agents as just an echo of the murder that was presented, since it would look so similar. Once Anderton began investigating the Lively murder, he also developed this plan with Crow to prevent the case from being investigated and therefore revealing his complicity in Lively's murder. After Laura's meeting with Burgess, she breaks Anderton out of prison, and he confronts Burgess at his home during the celebration. His team pipes in a video of Agatha's Minority Report vision of Burgess killing Anne Lively. Anderton appears in front of Burgess at his home. Burgess has a gun, and Anderton explains that he has a choice. He can either kill Anderton, as was predicted, and confirm the truth of pre-crime but go to jail, or not kill him and prove free will or something, but also go to jail for killing Lively. Burgess opts to kill himself instead. In a concluding sequence, Anderton narrates that pre-crime was shut down, all those imprisoned were paroled and released, and the precogs were taken to live in some secluded mountain cabin, where they are shown reading books together. Anderton is reconciled with his wife, who is now pregnant. In other words, everyone lives happily ever after. This ending, not to put too fine a point on it, is nonsense. In fact, this dumb, happy ending is indicative of a major flaw in Spielberg's output, where he shows us some real horrors that await us in our technological future. Think of the movies AI or Ready Player One. But then he hand-waves those horrors away with some boomer pabulum about how we'll just hope and love our way out of it. This is not to say that you can't have happy endings, but that given the nature of technological dystopias, the idea that some people will wake up and solve the problem is simply unsatisfying to any serious person. To put it in wrestling terms, if you buy what Spielberg is selling, you're a mark. The scene which produces this unsatisfying ending, an ending which mars the whole, and therefore is what I would describe as a deformity, is the scene between Anderton and Burgess, where Anderton tells Burgess he has a choice to make, and Burgess chooses suicide. The pivotal problem here is that it is the villain and not the hero who performs the crucial action. When confronted with his actions, Burgess apparently cannot live with the guilt or cannot reconcile himself to another murder, never mind that he physically drowned a woman, which is a far more difficult thing to do than to shoot a man who is threatening your projects, and he's also shot Danny Whitwer. And one murder does tend to make later ones easier to commit. This is the first of the two boomer tropes which produce the deformities of the movie. It is the idea that evil will self-limit or kill self once it is exposed. It isn't necessary to kill evil because it will create its own inevitable end. And this is quite simply a lie. It is not true psychologically, it is not true politically, it is not true morally, and it is dangerous to spread this lie among the souls of people. The reason it isn't true psychologically is because most people do not act believing their actions to be evil. Even if they may know their actions are bad, they rationalize that they are acting in the good interest of others. During the pandemic, policies were not pushed by powerful actors because they were hand-wringing villains, but because they believed these policies ultimately would produce some good result, whatever that good result might be. And even when some policies were exposed as mistaken or even malevolent after the fact, no one killed themselves over it. It isn't true politically, because even when narratives are exposed, people have so much invested in a narrative that they will not give it up easily. The narrative about Trump's collusion with Russia is a political example of this. The truth did not suddenly destroy the narrative, nor did the powerful suddenly give up the narrative once some evidence of it being a falsehood emerged. Rather, they spun it and controlled the narrative all the way down. Our regime in particular has shown itself quite adept at sidelining or discrediting inconvenient challenges to its narratives. Not long ago, as of the time this video was recorded, the U.S. government voted to send more billions of dollars to Ukraine to prop up not only that nation, but a narrative about that nation's ability to resist Russia. No, revelations of the truth do not mean that narratives cease to function. That's not how narratives work. They are not punctured like soap bubbles. They are worn away by the truth, like the sea slowly grinding down a rock. Truth may end up discrediting a narrative, but this only happens over time, often a long period of time, depending on the narrative. And there are times when people go to their deaths rather than give up certain narratives. This trope isn't true morally either, because evil is not something that will just go away on its own. Belief that it will is rather like the child's belief that if one turns on the light, the boogeyman will go away, or if one looks under the bed, the monsters there will cease to exist. It's dangerous to suggest that evil will self-limit, because you are not preparing people for life in this world. Children should not be endlessly indulged by leaving the light on. You can't confront evil without getting your hands dirty. This means it may be necessary to perform actions which can be questionable or even bad on their face. It may be necessary to fight or even to kill. If you're waiting for your enemies to all kill themselves, like the Heaven's Gate cult, once an expose drops on Twitter, you're going to be waiting for a very long time. Let's look at Burgess's actions in the movie with an eye to how his character is established earlier in the film and what we know about people like him from real life. His public persona is assaulted by a video feed piped in showing Burgess killing Anne Lively. This video is taken from Agatha's memory, although the audience has no way of knowing this, and Anderton's voice enters the hall where people are gathered and explains what the video is showing them. Quite simply, why should Burgess, or even why should the audience, accept this? Powerful men who have done evil things, and at this point Burgess has drowned a woman as part of a very elaborate plot to foil people who can see the future, and also shot a man to death in cold blood without a hint of remorse. Such people don't have to break down because of what amounts to a home movie. Perhaps Spielberg believes in the power of film to suddenly change narratives, so he can accept the idea that a movie, basically that's what it is, of Burgess killing a woman will suddenly turn everyone against him. And not only has Burgess killed, he has knowingly promoted a lie, specifically the lie that pre-crime predictions are infallible. Anderton finds out in the first act of the movie that this isn't true, that sometimes one of the precogs will make a prediction that goes against the consensus of the other two. A man who has killed and lied for this long isn't going to find telling one more lie to a room full of people primed to believe him all that challenging. To the contrary of what happens in the movie, Burgess has an easy spin. Oh, this is an echo, a memory of something that didn't happen. The man accusing me now is a convicted murderer and a drug addict who has been taking the powerful psychoactive drug Neuroin for 6 years, since the disappearance of his son. He's been depressed over this disappearance, which he blames himself for. In fact, earlier in this film, I myself tried to encourage him to get off this drug and get over his son's loss. But unfortunately, he didn't. My accuser lives in a world of his own. He recently murdered the man who kidnapped his son. And I guess we can all feel some sympathy for him over this, but really, this is just a deranged accusation from a broken man who cannot confront his own demons or the evils that he has done. For that matter, Burgess could accuse Anderton of generating the film, for as we know, such images can be easily faked, and even in Spielberg's time, they could be faked. The audience would be inclined to believe Burgess rather than their own lying eyes over some random video from a man they hardly know. With something like Pre-Crime, a program which expands governmental power and control, while at the same time providing a popular service that people want, the elimination or significant reduction of murder. With something like this, people would actually be inclined to support those who represent it, as Burgess does. Think of how the regime closes ranks around people like Dr. Fauci or President Zelensky or even President Biden and shields them from reputational attacks. All Burgess had to do to receive similar defense was to offer a facially plausible defense of himself, and such a defense was easily available. A villain explaining away his own exposure like this would be far closer to our lived reality than the fantasy Spielberg presents us. It would even be more in keeping with Burgess as he has been presented, that is, as a Machiavellian schemer willing to kill to protect his pre-crime program and his reputation. Burgess defending himself against this alleged evidence would have been a powerful scene indeed, one more in keeping both with the character and with the real world of human action. But even if this first trope had been removed, the final confrontation scene could still have happened. There is a second trope at work in it to produce the happy ending Spielberg desires. The second trope is the idea that we can make our own fate. This is a trope that has been around for a while. You can see it at almost all levels of media. For example, in a trash TV show like Hercules: The Legendary Journeys, Kevin Sorbo as Hercules says, "I believe we make our own fate." And this is supposed to be some kind of heroic viewpoint. You also see it in more high-concept fare, like the sci-fi time travel movie Looper, where the main character kills himself to change fate. One of the greatest film examples of all time, in my opinion, is in Lawrence of Arabia, where Lawrence proclaims, "Nothing is written unless you decide to write it." This is a trope our regime, and particularly the people who create media for our regime, seem to really love. The idea that we are not bound by something like fate is precious to them, and I think this stems from the Enlightenment idea that man should be made free from all unchosen bonds. Unchosen bonds, as has been pointed out by various thinkers in recent years, turns out to mean just about anything, including family, biology, religion, nationality, history, and therefore also fate. The idea that one's choices may be constrained by something like fate, that one's choices could be predicted and foreseen, and thus might be felt as unfree, is resisted by our regime. In Minority Report, the idea of fate appears 2 times. First, in its more classical conception, and second, in its modern post-Enlightenment conception. The first time is when Anderton confronts Crow. Agatha tells Anderton that he has a choice to kill Crow or not. Anderton suspects he may have been set up. He hesitates and seems to be on the verge of choosing a different path when Crow forces the issue. Because at the end of the day, while Anderton may have a choice, Crow also has a choice to make, and he is interested in fulfilling the fated vision because he has made a deal for his family's financial security. He ends up producing the situation where Anderton shoots him more or less as envisioned, even as Anderton seems to be trying to make a different choice. This idea of trying to escape one's fate and only fulfilling it is what I call the classical conception. In Sophocles' Oedipus the King, Oedipus leaves his home because of a prophecy that he will murder his father and marry his mother, only to bring about this very fate, because unbeknownst to him, he is a foundling, and had been made away with as a baby because of this very same prophecy. Oedipus brings about the full revelation of his fate through his determination to investigate the matter fully. This idea that one's fate is something that binds one in such a way that one's free choice brings it about as a matter of course is at the heart of Greek conception of tragedy. But this conception is essentially counter to the Enlightenment ideal of freedom. In Minority Report, this counter view is made explicit by concerns that are voiced over people being imprisoned for crimes they haven't actually committed, but which were merely predicted. Although I will note in passing that the UK's proposed online harms bill may allow for preemptive punishments to be made in certain situations against persons who are deemed likely to commit an offense in the future. The existence of nudge units and similar techniques for managing populations suggests that in some ways pre-crime is already among us. What this may suggest about Enlightenment ideals of freedom in our society as it really operates, I will leave for another day. The second appearance of the idea of fate comes in the final confrontation between Burgess and Anderton. The precogs have predicted that Burgess will kill Anderton, but Anderton suggests to Burgess that he has a choice. The choice being to prove pre-crime correct but murder Anderton and go to jail for it, or to be exposed and have pre-crime collapse as a program but not commit murder. Although presumably Burgess would still be guilty of the murders of Anne Lively and Danny Whitwer, so it isn't really much of a choice for him. Burgess chooses to kill himself, the same choice made by Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character in Looper, when confronted by a similar knotty situation involving fate and time travel. I call this a post-Enlightenment conception of fate. That is, a situation where an individual, armed with knowledge of a situation, has the capacity to choose another course. In other words, that nothing is written except what the individual chooses to write, as Lawrence says it. This contrasts sharply with the conception we see in Oedipus, where the very act of acquiring the knowledge necessary to make a choice leaves Oedipus in the situation where he discovers that his fated choice has in fact already been made. Oedipus opts for self-blinding in this situation, destroying that by which he searched out and uncovered his fate, uncovered the truth, namely his eyes. Perhaps in an echo of this, the modern conception is exemplified by suicide. The individual who stands outside of fate, in doing so, also puts an end to his existence. Whatever we may think of this conception of fate, in this film I regard it as a deformity. First, because I don't accept that it is in Burgess's character. Max von Sydow tries, through his excellent acting, to convey that he is being tortured by his conscience, but this is insufficiently supported by the script, and I don't buy it. Second, because I don't regard it as viable to show that evil will just end itself once exposed, as I mentioned earlier. And third, because I think it ultimately means that the decisive action of the film is not taken by the hero. At least in Hamlet, Prince Hamlet does eventually kill the king. With these two deformities in place, Burgess being exposed and killing himself, all issues seem to be resolved. But if we remove those deformities, what happens? What is the fragmentary Greek statue that remains if these odd growths are lopped off of it? I think the movie that remains behind is far more interesting and revealing of our own situation. The film shows us a world in which people live economically stratified lives with opulent bankers, such as the man at the beginning, who was arrested for potentially murdering his wife when he catches her cheating. And it also shows us people who live in slums with mass surveillance of everyone, a life where people are economic cogs manipulated at every turn, a world in which even the most talented, in this case the precogs, are essentially slaves to the system. The precogs are almost literally slaves, kept in a permanently liminal state, their talents exploited for pre-crime regardless of their interests or intentions. When Agatha is removed from the system, she expresses horror at having to relive these constant visions of murder, and having to see it in person seems even worse for her. And yet, those talented persons are treated with an ersatz religious feeling. The place where they are kept is called the Temple, and we notice that when Anderson brings Agatha to the cyber criminal, he recognizes who she is and kneels as if she were some kind of priestess. And ultimately, it is a system that is founded not only on exploitation, but also safety based on lies. The lie of infallibility, I think, is something that even in my version of the film would be exposed to some degree. In particular, Anderton's estranged wife and his pre-crime team have learned by the end of the film that the precogs disagree with one another and that they make mistakes, and thus that their system is not quite what it is presented as. They would be confronted with a choice, either to serve that flawed system and keep their doubts quiet, or to quit and let others take their place. This at least would be an interesting dilemma, because it's one that we ourselves have to deal with as our own regime grows increasingly fragile and unable to cope with fundamental problems. It's certainly an interesting question to raise, which this film's ending as it is never allows to come up. How does one serve a system when its premises have been revealed to be false and to have evil consequences? And if Burgess killed Anderton, as I believe he should, the very system which he set up and which the government has now adopted would be forced to convict him. He would be haloed and locked in the same virtual prison as his victims, an appropriate enough fate. There would be an uncomfortable truth revealed in his fate, which would be public knowledge. What would be lost in changing things this way is the comfortable notion that a dystopia can just be unmade. This idea at the end of the movie that three people with precognitive powers are just going to be allowed to spend their days idly reading books in a mountain cabin is absurd to the point of being cartoonish. However, the matter-of-fact way in which Spielberg shows how they are used by the system, prior to the cartoonish ending that is completely correct. They aren't even allowed to live fully human lives. They are at once kept permanently childlike and asleep, but they're also treated with a kind of religious reverence. Our own elites have a certain quality like this as well. One could imagine humans in the world of Minority Report admonishing others to trust the precogs, much as people admonish us now to trust the science. Ultimately, Minority Report as it exists is unsatisfying because it does show us fragments of truth. We are in some ways close to a situation in which much can be predicted, not necessarily with precognitive powers, but with big data, with pattern recognition, with nudging, marketing, and mass propaganda. The world we see in this movie is not far away from us. It's not far away from a world which is in the process of coming to be, if it isn't already here. And ultimately, we need to confront what this means if we have any chance either of avoiding it, or at least of avoiding some of the worst consequences we fear from such a world. And ultimately, the film does not allow us to do this, because it prefers to lie to us about what we need to do to avoid the worst. That is, we need to do nothing. Evil will be exposed, and it will take care of itself, we are told. We're still in charge of our fate. We still choose what will be written. But what if instead we are like Oedipus, and we have already fulfilled the prophecy, and all that awaits is for us to discover that our fate has already been chosen? Thank you very much for listening, and I'll see you in the next fragment.